But one of the reasons Ireland, to come back to your question, has done such a better job is because I believe the Catholic Church here did a marvellous job of erasing any trace or tolerance for racism. And that contrasts with the rise of racism in France, which is one of Europe's most secular societies.
Which is strongly associated with the Catholic Church in France.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 141 for the 18th of August, 2022. Magical thinking is a great phrase that I learned a few years ago. It's a concept that's useful to understand someone's thought processes, maybe even your own. If you know what it is, skip forward about 2 minutes. If you don't, it's important to understand that it's not a positive thing. In fact, it's very negative. The concept of magical thinking is often used by therapists, psychologists, and so on to classify a particular thought process and to help their patients to get over it. You can see it at a comical level, sometimes with kids. Don't step on the cracks in the pavements or the monster will get you. That's basically the core of it, believing that one thing can affect another thing where 2 seconds of rational thought by an adult will tell you that they can't. People with mental health problems frequently exhibit magical thinking. A very famous example would be John Hinckley Jr., the guy who shot Ronald Reagan in 1981. He did it because he thought it would impress the actress Jodie Foster and make him fall in love with him. He was wrong for a whole bunch of reasons there. Everyone can see that isn't rational thinking, but a lot of people might well have a lucky pen to do the lotto with, or salute a magpie, or not want to stay on the 13th floor of a hotel, or whatever. Those things are basically harmless. If they give people comfort, there isn't really any point in doing anything about them. The magical thinking that therapists focus on that harms people interferes with their life to the point that they can't live normally. That's what I'm talking about here. There are people who have such compulsive obsessions that they can't leave their house until they've spent hours switching on and off lights or locking and unlocking doors, and they're certain that their house will burn down if they don't perform a ritual like this. Other forms of magical thinking include doing things that are disconnected from the desired effect, but the disconnection isn't so instantly apparent. This often crops up in people that have suffered abuse. They're often quite tragic, such as an abused child doing anything that they think that will cause the abuse to stop. These cases are too sad to even give examples here, but you get the idea. A child or even an adult telling themselves that they've caused this incident of abuse themselves because they didn't do this or that right, and clinging to that thought because the reality that they would be abused anyway is too horrific to confront. Even more tragically, these thought patterns can be exploited by the abuser and used to put the blame for the abuse on the victim. It's a therapist's job to help the victim to see that the magical thinking is just wrong. So that's magical thinking. It's something that's not nearly as nice as the name sounds. I thought about that when I was thinking about 2 issues that have been in the news in the past few weeks. I think that magical thinking has a particular role when it comes to Irish whataboutery, when people clearly on the wrong side of a political debate try to divert attention to a different topic and get away from their own losing argument. The first was the emissions reductions that are going to be imposed on farming. Agriculture is really getting a big pass here. Agriculture is by far the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. It emits more than the entire transport sector and the entire electricity generation sector combined. The government has assigned transport a 50% reduction over the next 8 years compared to 2018 outputs, and electricity a 75% reduction. By contrast, agriculture is only having to meet a 25% reduction. I say only, I know that's seriously challenging, but given that it's the biggest emitter, 25% is a way smaller reduction than, for example, the 75% reduction for electricity. As with any suggestion for change, there's a lot of opposition, and as with anything to do with farming, that opposition is very well organised and has lots of access to the media and no shortage of sympathetic commentators. Every possible point in opposition gets more than its fair share of media coverage. One of those points is that, in the Amazon, deforestation is going at a pace to provide land for farming, which is often beef ranching, under the COVID-denying, climate change-denying, populist Trump of the tropics, President Bolsonaro. The line that I'm talking about was best exemplified by a whole slew of people who said some variation of the theme that it was better not to do anything to reduce Irish beef production because the expanding beef production in Brazil is more carbon intensive, meaning that it emits more CO2 equivalent per kilo of meat than production in Ireland. I'm in no way sure of that claim, by the way, but I'll let that pass for the moment. It's the magical thinking that I'm concerned with here. Maybe you've spotted it. It's to imagine that there is a cause and effect between reducing Irish beef production and increasing beef production in Brazil. Irish farmers and their representatives are essentially saying that the reason they want to keep up beef production is because that will reduce beef production in Brazil. There is, of course, not a shred of evidence for this. The other major case of magical thinking was in the reaction to Sabina Higgins' letter to the Irish Times last month. There were a whole load of problems with the letter, not least that she signalled that the invading and defending countries were on an equal moral footing by saying that the world should persuade, quote, President Vladimir Putin of Russia and President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine to agree a ceasefire and negotiations. But I don't want to get into that, or the issue of the presidency being above politics. I'm interested in the opinion piece that prompted her letter by Geoffrey Roberts, a former professor of history at UCC. His piece, also in the Irish Times, was titled, Ukraine Must Grab Peace from Jaws of Unwinnable War, which summed up his content well. Also summed up a large body of opinion that was claiming to support the president's wife in her well-meaning intervention. Basically, the recommendation was that Ukraine should trade land for peace and security going forward. It might be a bitter pill. They would have to accept Russia ruling over some areas of Ukraine, but it would save Ukrainian lives and the independence of the rest of Ukraine. That was the argument. The magical thinking element of this is that there isn't the slightest evidence that such a deal is on offer from Putin. And even if it was, there isn't the slightest reason to believe that he could be trusted to fulfill such a deal. Allowing Russia to establish itself unhindered in the currently occupied territory of Ukraine, to dig in, regroup, resupply and rearm, would do nothing more than give Putin a whole new base to attack the rest of the country as soon as he saw that was to his advantage. Even if he was offering peace for land, he simply couldn't be trusted. But the main problem is that Putin isn't offering peace for land. That deal simply isn't on offer. The only offer Putin has made is that Ukrainians should lay down their weapons and let his army take over. Not only that, but he, his foreign minister and prime minister Lavrov and Medvedev, and his propaganda outlets like RIA Novosti and Preveni Kanal, his largest TV station, have explicitly said that they intend to destroy the whole of Ukraine, literally wipe it off the map, murder the whole of its intelligentsia and army, destroy all of its cultural artifacts and institutions, wipe out its language, and subjugate its population with decades of re-education in revenge for the supposed crime of electing a Nazi government. Putin is not asking for land in return for peace. He is asking to be allowed to commit genocide in peace. That's the awfulness of it. And I suspect that that awfulness is why old lefties who are in the habit of trotting out the line that everything bad in the world flows from the Western Anglo-American alliance, they just can't cope with all the evidence that, in this case, that isn't true. And equally, farming is such a traditional and conservative way of life that many people just can't fathom that things are going to have to change, and change a lot, and change quickly, and they revert to magical thinking to avoid an unpleasant prospect. But I'm sure that's not the only magical thinking out there. Maybe you can come up with some of your own examples. Tweet them to us at Here's How Podcast. In a moment, we'll have that interview with Marc Coleman, but first I want to say thanks to all of the patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who donates on Patreon. We don't get any huge amount of money out of it, not like some Irish podcasters I could mention. It pays for things like web hosting, but Kevin and myself basically donate our time for free. It's also a great morale booster. When we get a new patron, it lets us know that there are people out there who listen and who appreciate the podcast. We make a big effort to cover things that are undercovered in Irish media. You're more than welcome to listen for free, but if you think that you could do the same as the other donors and throw in the price of an Irish beef burger or even a Brazilian beef burger once or twice a month, there's details how to do that on the website and at the end of the show.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? Follow at Here's How Podcast on Twitter and like Here's How on Facebook for updates on each show's contents.
For 10 years, Marc Coleman was a broadcaster, a journalist, a columnist, and an author. These days, by day, he is a business consultant and he releases his opinions on Twitter and maybe in a book that he's writing at other times. Marc, you and I got into a spat a while back about the value of religious education and whether the state should be paying for that. Before I tell everybody what you think, why don't you tell us what you think on that?
So really, thanks, William, for giving me the chance to do the interview, because we were having I'd say an exchange, and the problem with Twitter is the 140 character rule, does not allow you to discuss and debate a topic on which, hundreds, if not thousands of books have been written. So thanks for the chance to give you a higher granularity explanation of where I'm coming from on this. I suppose there's two aspects of it. One is the value of religious education, and how it informs society, and the second, how it benefits society, or at least in my view that it does. And secondly is whether the state, something which is funded by taxpayers, should have the right to aggregate choice on behalf of all taxpayers in a way that a majority or even a sizable minority of taxpayers may not agree with. So to sum it up, so that I don't take up all the introduction, on the first part, even if I were a complete atheist, and I'm not, I'm baptized Catholic, I would describe myself as absolutely convinced Christian. I'm not quite sure what denomination I am. I go to Mass, but I have huge respect for different denominations, including Presbyterianism, Calvinism, and even aspects of Orthodox Judaism. But I set those aside in my views. I'm coming at this from somebody who studied economic, social science, and public policy for 9 years of my life. And I am absolutely convinced, and also from my studies of history, that modern civilization and most of the good that is in it would be unthinkable and would never have been achieved without the centuries of patient work by people who were driven by religious faith of all faiths to build a society that we now enjoy. And that to do away with that would be an absolute catastrophe, which would bring about unforeseen dangers and calamities. But the second part of it is that I do not believe that any state has a right to arrogate unto itself the power to tell parents how their taxes should be used to educate their children. Of course, there is a curriculum, and we need to set out a curriculum for the purposes of fairness in examinations and standardization and all of that. But in terms of the values and the mores, the state does not have the power to overthrow the right of parents and impose its values or a lowest common denominator of values. Parents must have the right, subject, of course, to some common agreed shared value system. They must have the right to give their children within the hours of the school that their taxes pay for the religious instruction that they want.
Okay,
And of course,
pause with that for a second.
there
Pause
are
with that for a second, because I just want to clarify
there are
what you're saying.
logistical problems. There are logistical problems with that.
No, pause for a moment. Pause for a moment, Mark,
Yeah.
because I just want to clarify what you're saying there. So you say that parents, and in this case you're talking about Catholic, obviously we have different denominations, but Catholic is still by far the largest individual one in the country, that Catholic and or other denominations have the right to have their children given religious instruction during school hours in a school that is largely taxpayer funded. And I just want to draw a distinction between religious instruction and general education about the phenomena of religion. So when I hear, and I want to make sure we're using the terms in the same way, when I hear religious instruction, as I understand it, that means telling people this is what the, in this case, Catholic Church believes, and this is the true thing that you should believe. Is that what you understand that to mean? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, I think that the state certainly should have a role in communicating and conveying respect for all religions and races and ethnic groups. And that can be part of a central curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
But remember that the parents themselves are those taxpayers that you're talking about. And remember that religious values, so civic instruction in respect and understanding of all religions is a good thing. And that probably should be part of a curriculum. But where schools need to respect parents' rights is that they may want the values of a certain ethos to permeate the wider education of their child. For example, we teach children commerce, and we teach them, financial skills, and, all about profit making. But religious values will tell us that money is not everything. Spirituality is important. Concern for the poor is important. And parents coming from one of the Abrahamic religions are subscribing to a value system that the profit motive, which is increasingly dominating in our materialistic society, they will want their children reared in an ethos that balances that with a wider communitarian concern for wider welfare. And I think that's a good thing. And those values are formed early in life. And this is why I believe those values need to be part of a primary and secondary school curriculum for those parents that wish it.
Okay, I want to pause on the idea of what those values are for a moment. We'll come back to that. But I just want to ask you, because as you know, I've listened to you on the radio, you were on News Talk for a good few years, and I've heard you express opinions about a whole variety of things. And given the political outlook that you seem to have, which I respect, even if I, don't agree necessarily with everything, I think you're a reasonable fellow. I think you're coming maybe from a fairly libertarian point of view, but I don't really see you as someone building a cabin in the woods with a twitchy finger on an AR-15 and jars of your own urine stored in cupboards and writing pamphlets about the world government in league with lizard people or whatever. But I think you're relatively libertarian in a more sensible sense, and that you have a skepticism about the government having too much control over people's lives. And it seems to me, even though, as you say, the parents are largely the taxpayers, that those two sets don't overlap perfectly, but they overlap very significantly. And when the government has a lot of power over lots of things in our lives, that necessarily means that the individuals have less power over those things in their lives. And, as you say, the taxpayers' money rightfully belongs to the taxpayer. But the reality of it is, when the minister is signing the checks, or whoever is signing the checks, that person has a lot of power, and it's just inevitable that if the government is in any way signing the checks or is taking responsibility for, as you say, this type of moral education or this type of ethical view on things, it's inevitable that the government will be influencing that. Are you really comfortable with that?
I'm trying. There's a lot in. It's a very rich question and a very rich lead up to the question, and I'm trying to figure out which part of it you would like me to respond to. But
Well, the core point
let
is
me try and
that
phrase the question
we
if I
don't want to
understand it
give the
rightly.
government. Okay, go ahead.
So what I think you're saying is, if we want to give the government the power over us as individuals? Let me say, first of all, I'm not a libertarian in the extreme sense, and I am as worried as you are with the rise of extremism, particularly in the United States, and the sort of extremist, extra constitutional sort of gun lobby. But I would warn that one of the reasons for that is that America, while it is a great country full of great people, I don't believe it's actually a society anymore. And in the last 40
Yeah,
years,
I think you're
and
correct, but I don't want to go down
bear
that
with
path.
me, bear with me, because
Okay.
I'm actually answering your question, but I need to kind of, as you built up your question, I need to build
Go
up
for
my
it.
answer too. So what I'm trying to say is that you did have a society in America 40 years ago where you had a much greater sense of shared values, and they were largely Judeo-Christian values. They were moderate Judeo-Christian values, and I think, unfortunately, that common value system has broken apart, and you now have America drifting into extremes of both the far right and the extreme left as well. And for every nut extremist on the right, there's an extremist on the left, by the way. And that's very regrettable. And that's precisely why I believe that government, without unduly restricting the rights of individual taxpayers, such as atheists who do not believe in religious education, should try to build flexible mechanisms that give as much diversity as possible in educational values. The curriculum, of course, on mathematics and English and history and Irish and all that needs to be standardized, accept that.
What about
But
biology?
insofar as values inform the character building and the moral structure of the human, the government's job is not to impose
Mark,
one religion or
pause.
another.
What if somebody says, I don't want my kids taught about evolution?
If they say their kids don't want to be taught about evolution, well, we can say that I personally would disagree with their choice, but I would respect it. I'd strongly disagree with it, and I'd urge them, to think again. But I do not believe the state has the power to overturn or interfere in the private. There are Orthodox Jews who don't believe in evolution. There are Muslims who don't believe in it. It's not just Christians. There
Sure,
are
yeah,
other
but it doesn't matter who
religions,
they are.
we could go into, who don't believe that science is the be all and the end all. I believe in rational science. But by the way, one of the most devout, Usher, who was, I think, did we both go to Trinity? William Usher was regarded as the foremost scientist of his day. He founded the University Philosophical Society, which I'm very proud to have been the 304th honorary secretary. And he was regarded at the time as one of the avant-garde, most progressive thinkers of the day.
Yes.
He didn't believe in evolution. So it just tells you that science itself,
I should note, Mark, am I correct in saying that he is the person upon whose calculations this idea from modern day evangelicals, they come to the idea that the world is 6,000 years old?
Exactly, the Earth is about 6,000 years old. But look at, in 100 and 200 years' time, with quantum mechanics, our understanding of how old the university is, that scientists hold today, may look as ridiculous in 200 years' time as Usher's calculations seem to us now. Humanity the Earth is about 4 billion years old. If you look at a clock and it was a 24-hour clock, human intelligence has only been around for a fraction of a second of that 24-hour period. The idea that we know it all, even from a scientific standpoint, is nonsense. We don't. We have thousands, tens of thousands of more years of scientific discovery ahead of us. And I actually believe, particularly interesting is quantum mechanics, may actually lead us back to many of the precepts that our ancestors had, and many of the precepts our ancestors has, which look completely ridiculous to us now, may be validated in the most surprising way by the science of the future. I wouldn't rule that out.
Okay, fair enough. But my question wasn't that. My question is, when you have the government making decisions about what is and is not the ethical, the moral standards that should be taught in schools, isn't that a problem?
Well, I guess it is. I guess we're agreeing. So the question is who should take those decisions? And I'm a great believer in more local government, more devolution. I like the Swiss model of government, for example, where they have cantons. The Swiss had their own religious divisions between Catholic and Protestants. They were as fierce as the divisions in our country. And the way they resolved them was by allowing different cantons to make their own decisions. Now, we over-centralize decision-making in government. I think if some issues like religious faith in schools are devolved to local or regional governments, you'd be surprised how practical and sensible people are at local level in coming up with practical solutions that respect everybody's right to choose. And by the way,
Sure, no, but Mark, you're dodging the question. Mark, you're dodging the question. And by the way, I'm surprised, but I won't go into detail on it, at the idea that Irish local government is practical and solution-oriented. But leave that aside.
It can be.
In a school, in any given school, somebody is signing the check. And if the person who's signing the check has also the freedom to decide the moral, ethical standards that should be taught in the school, in our times when we have much more diverse society than we had previously. I think the problem existed all along, but it is just more evident now. I think that is likely to run into an awful lot of problems because you have essentially two options, two things that could happen. One is that you have one perhaps larger ethical view that's just enforced on everybody, which I think is obviously unacceptable. And the other option is that you have some sort of happy-clappy mishmash that seeks to sweep under the carpet differences and divisions in society and pretend that there is an overarching ethical view that everybody can subscribe to. And I think neither of those are necessarily a good idea.
I think, right, if I understand what you're saying have a common sort of curriculum that everybody can agree on, and then park the religious differences elsewhere and don't have the state involved in that. And I'm fine with that, provided that you do not expect tax-paying parents to devote another 2 or 3 hours of their lives a week to send their kids to add-on. So provided you make space within the 9 to 2 or 9 to 3 o'clock school day to accommodate that split, I'm absolutely fine with that. And we've seen the logistical and management efforts by government to accommodate special needs teachers, and that's been done more or less successfully. I mean, there are problems, but it's more or less successful. Or if there are problems, they don't pertain to the special needs area. They're more relating to teacher salaries. And I believe that similar logistical and managerial solution can be found to this problem.
Yeah, it could. Pause with that, because I want to have a look at that idea. So, for example, I think that most people of all religions and of none could put up with a situation where, for example, Wednesday afternoon was not for core classes, and if this religion or that wanted to send in either the Catholic priest and Church of Ireland vicar and whatever else, and also perhaps not formal religious organizations, and they then have a voluntary thing whereby they can, kids are in the school, they can reorganize per room. And if it's, for example, Catholics preparing children for First Holy Communion, they can do that on their time, and children from other faiths can go to other things, or people can go home. Pause, Mark, I want to finish this point.
Yeah.
But as it happens, because they were previously in a very powerful position, the Catholic Church has gone to very, very extensive efforts to make that impossible. And in particular, there is an explicit instruction for primary schools, Catholic primary schools, which are more than 90% of the primary schools in the country, to have their religion class right in the middle of the day, And people might not happen in the leafy suburbs of South County Dublin where, the media elite hang out. But in most places, in most towns, if you are someone who doesn't want your child to get Catholic religious instruction, then you will be told that you have to show up at 12, having dropped your kid off at 9 or whatever, show up at 12, take them out of the school and entertain them or do whatever it is for an hour and then bring them back at 1 in order to continue the school day. And it's deliberately done. There's no doubt about this. It's deliberately done in order to make as difficult as possible. Now, allow me to finish. Mark, allow me to finish because there's a whole host of examples of how Catholic school boards, I think it is perhaps more than the actual individual teachers, have gone to really incredible and incredibly vindictive lengths to try to make life difficult for people who didn't want to participate in that. Parents have been told, for example, that their child must sit in a room and not even be allowed to read a book, because if they were allowed to read a book, then other kids and other families would not want their children to participate as well. And that seems very clear that there is a determination to coerce people who are maybe really not wanting it or maybe on the margin of not wanting their children to take part in Catholic instruction in order to coerce them into doing that. And that's a situation that the particularly Catholic school boards created. And that may in years to come back to bite them on the ass, but that is what they created. And that's incredibly unethical, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot in your question. It's a very large question. It's a very rich question. It's got a lot of great stuff in it. But I need to challenge one assertion that you've made. And it's a widely spread assertion that the Catholic Church is the wielder of some tremendous state power. May I just remind you and your listeners that for the last 500 years, the Catholic Church in Ireland has been one of the most politically powerless and persecuted groups of people in Western Europe. The Catholic Church was forbidden, priests were tortured and killed, people were prevented from going to Mass.
Catholics not in the lifetime of anybody alive today.
Hundreds of years. No, but excuse me. It is in the last 100 years where the secular independent state completely failed to provide the very basics of education and healthcare services that the church stepped in. It has been pilloried for that role for the failures in the cases of a minority of clergy, failures which were the same failures as happened in secular societies in Europe, where those failures of women treated appallingly as they were in the Magdalen laundries. I can tell you stories from secular Sweden, secular Russia. The same thing happened, but we have pilloried the church for mistakes that were made by institutions of all faiths and none in the last 100 years. And what we have forgotten is the vast, vast good that the church did where the secular state completely failed, and it established its role in health and education against the state and against the backdrop of an imperial institution that for 300 years tried to wipe it out. The only church in this country that ever had state funding was the Church of Ireland, which received tithes from the government.
Again, not in the lifetime of anybody allowed to. Mark, I want to challenge. Mark, I want to challenge. Mark, I want to challenge on one thing you said, because you said something that I think is factually inaccurate. You said, Mark, you said one thing here that's, I think, factually inaccurate.
The final point. Okay. If the church has a role in education, whether we like it or not, it is because on the ground level, not coming from the government, but on the ground level, it is what voters and taxpayers want. And the question is how, in areas, particularly rural areas, where there are minorities, how can we respect their needs without discommoding the majority? And that, I think, is the challenge.
Okay, I agree that there is a challenge in terms of meeting all needs. But I think what you said is incorrect in some things, and it is a fallacy that is pushed around. You said that the church provided for health and education and welfare and so forth when the state refused to do so. Let's be really clear. Mark, allow me to finish.
It is failing once again.
Mark, allow me to finish this.
If you compare the gross inefficiency of the secular state's management of our health services with the efficiency and cleanliness of our hospitals 40 years ago, it is clear that the secular state is failing to provide the health services properly. And if you want to talk about taxpayer rights, taxpayers are far more infringed by the failure of secular healthcare provision, thanks to the ineptitude of the HSE, than the church, which ran, and the orders which ran our hospitals far more efficiently, cost efficiently, and actually cared for patients and did all the little jobs that now so many of our hospitals are failing to do.
Okay, pause with that for a second, because I don't think that the causation was always going in the direction that you say it was. Because, for example, when Noel Brown in 1948 attempted to set up a very, very rudimentary free healthcare system, the Taoiseach at the time, John A. Costello, was called in by the bishops and ordered not to do it because this was against Catholic theology. And so the idea that the church stepped in to make up for its state failure is not really true in that case, because they were very influential and made sure that the state did not get involved in, for example, healthcare, because they saw that as their remit. And in the various, for the various Magdalene laundries, in the investigations, it appears to have been pretty common that when one of these Magdalene laundries was not making as much profit as it might be because the numbers of women incarcerated there had gone down, letters went out from bishops to priests to go around and see if they could find women, working class, poor women, who had children who could be taken away from them and sent to the schools, and the women sent to the Magdalene laundries. So I think that you're portraying that as somehow a state failure being compensated for by a benevolent church isn't always true. Although I agree with you in a lot of cases about the state failure.
In fairness now, William, that's actually not what I was saying. But let me clarify. I'm not saying you're putting words into my mouth, but maybe I didn't express myself clearly enough. Those involved in the Magdalene laundries and those who faced down Noel Brown should hang their heads in shame. I completely agree that is the other extreme. But I qualify it by saying that if the bishops had that power, it derived not from any constitutional position per se.
They had soft power.
It derived from the support they had from the voters, which politicians knew about. So it was an appalling abuse of that power, but it was not per se like Britain, where you have an established Church of England, or Sweden, where you have an established Lutheran Church. There was only a constitutional nod to the Catholic Church in our constitution that was abolished in 1974. If the bishops had and abused, which they did, that power, they did so because it derived from the support from the people, not the state. But in relation to this, I wasn't saying that the benevolent church was overcoming an inept state in the case of the Magdalene laundries. Far from it. In fact, I denounced
they engineered a situation that was massively profitable.
That. What I was saying was contrasting the financial inefficiency of the modern state in providing, for all the experts and PhDs and academics it has advising it, it's blowing taxpayers' money through the roof in providing services that were provided far more cost effectively by the church, and notwithstanding the compensation which the church should pay to the victims of its own mismanagement and gross abuse. It is still the case, and it I think indicates no disrespect to the human suffering of those people. It is still the fact that the church in aggregate has made a far, far greater contribution to the Irish state and economy and people than it has inflicted, as it undoubtedly has, trauma and suffering on an unacceptable level. Where it has inflicted suffering, and the stories of the Magdalene laundry, it is no defense, but it is important to say it was not unique in that respect. I can point you to societies like Sweden, like Soviet Russia, in Ukraine in the 50s and 60s and 70s, in Russia, in secular Romania. There are equally appalling stories of human suffering. That is a result of human evil, and unfortunately it is common to institutions of all faiths and none. It is not specific to the church, the Catholic Church, but that does not excuse the Catholic Church in the instances where it did fail in that regard, which it clearly did.
Okay, I have a bit of skepticism about the argument that everything they did wrong was just individual human failure and everything they did right was due to the institution, and that righteousness can be inherited by the current organization. But pause that for a moment. What I want to just ask about is the very, very practicalities of this. And you were, when we were on Twitter, you were very much defending the Catholic Church patronage of schools, and primary schools are obviously particularly important in this case. And don't want to rip on people who live in South County Dublin or urban media elite and so forth too much, but most people in Ireland live somewhere where their kids, basically all the kids on the road, go to the same school, and they have little or no physical opportunity to go to any other school unless they're very wealthy, unless they can devote a huge amount of time to commuting, and unless they can perhaps send their kids to a boarding school. But the great bulk of people, everyone on the road, goes to the same school. And that's a good thing. That's a pro-community thing. And as our communities have developed in every corner of the country, so it is not only in leafy areas of South County Dublin that you get diversity. I was very taken by an interview that Virgin Media reporter did about Ukrainian kids being integrated in a school in Kerry, and they said, and let's talk to the Irish kids about what they think of the Ukrainian kids coming. The diversity of the Irish kids was very remarkable in that as well. And particularly where we have quite a lot of immigrants, not just the Ukrainians, but everyone, it is particularly important that people meet and mingle and have friends right across the community, and not to create a siloed society, as has happened on the continent and perhaps also in the UK as well, where you have areas of a city that are definably of one ethnic group and another, and they all have their own schools as well as everything else. Ireland, perhaps because of last mover advantage, has done better on that. And the way in which majority ethos was enforced when you and I were kids, I would hope you would recognise was completely unacceptable, and it's not something that we could do now. So if you're to have those two things, to have most kids on the road all going to the same school so that you build a real community in the towns and villages and larger cities of the country, then it is not feasible to enforce one ethos on all of them. Isn't that correct?
Well, you see, the thing about this is a great snug conversation, right? And you ask a question at the end of it, and I love the richness of what you're saying, but the problem is you make before every question a number of suppositions and assumptions that I don't agree with. So
tell me the ones you disagree with specifically.
Well, let me start with the one that the church enforced a majority ethos on us as kids. First of all, I don't think kids play a blind bit of notice to a lot of what they're taught at school. So I think one supposition or assumption that we both might be making erroneously is that, it's going to have much influence on kids in any event. I suspect that whatever system of value instruction we have in schools, kids are going to get most of their values from social media, just like we got them from the back of the bike shed. So, let's start by recognizing the limitations of an education system in influencing any young person, because they tend to be quite capable of making their own minds up.
Pretty influential on the crux between the Falls and the Shankill.
Pretty influential. But second, let me say, and here is where I do need to really make a strong point. Mm-hmm. You say that you use the term last mover advantage to describe why we have done a better job of integrating migrants. And I agree with you that we have. But actually, the reason we have, I think the key driver is precisely the Catholic social values of inclusiveness, of respect for people of all different faiths, colours, which we grew up with, and the engagement of the church in the yes, absolutely.
Well, I didn't.
And I believe it is no accident to me. And my big hero, my intellectual hero, is a man called Edmund Burke. You may have heard of him. Mm-hmm. He was regarded as a great liberal in his day, although he would now be regarded as a sort of a conservative thinker. But what he explained, and this I think goes to the heart of what we're discussing, is that the power of any government to be effective in imposing shared rules and values ultimately depends on the faith and the value system of the people on the ground, or what he called the little battalions. And to sum up what he believed, You cannot make a better world from the top down, that is, by government action, unless someone is acting from the bottom up to make better people to live in that world. I don't believe government and religion are enemies. I believe they're complementary co-actors. They're part of a yin and yang. And one of the reasons that Western democracy is going off the rails is we've forgotten that. We have assumed that only government can improve our lives and society, and we are more and more doing away with the institutions like the church, the nuclear family, settled communities. We are turning ourselves into atomized nomads with no common value reference point at all, and we are expecting government to be able to patch up the problems that result. It's going to head for disaster. But one of the reasons Ireland, to come back to your question, has done such a better job is because I believe the Catholic Church here did a marvelous job of erasing any trace or tolerance for racism. And that contrasts with the rise of racism in France, which is one of Europe's most secular societies.
Which is
And I
strongly
believe
associated
that
with the Catholic Church in France.
as Burke said, if you create a vacuum, something base and evil will enter into it. The French establishment has spent the last 100 years trying to wipe Catholicism off the map in France, and the result it is create a moral vacuum into which the far right and elements of the far left have now created a bitterly divided social society.
Okay, I don't, Mark, I don't want to go too much into France. I don't want to go too much into France.
The same is happening in secularized Republican America. I thank God that we have a good Judeo-Christian value system, which has made us one of the most successful countries in absorbing what I believe is now 15% of our population have come to us from other shores. And I believe that our ethos and value system has played a huge role in that success.
Okay, pause with that. First of all, not going to go too deeply into France, but there's no question whatsoever that the far right in France is very intimately connected with the relatively small section of the population that are faithful Roman Catholics. But I don't want to go into that in great detail. But hold on for 1 second.
Not exactly true.
There's a distinct association. Mark, I'm not going to get into that. Mark, I'm not going to get into that because
they are doing so. They are doing so because in France, the intellectual left have deliberately, systematically destroyed the Christian democratic movement in France, and they have done so to give those voters no option. One of the biggest reasons for the far right's rise in France is that they have been facilitated by a left which does not want a cogent, moderate, credible alternative to what they believe in. And that's another debate, I think.
Okay, Mark, I think the idea that people who vote against the far-right party are the people who are responsible for its strength is a bit strange, but I just want to go on to one thing here. No, Mark, I'm going to move on to Mark. I'm going to move on to one thing. Mark, I want to move on to one thing here.
If you look at Francois Mitterrand, who was a left-wing politician, changed the electoral rules to facilitate the rise of the far right in order to split his opposition and keep in power.
I'm not going to go down that road. The one thing I want to look at here is a religious instruction book, which I actually recognize, and I think it says a lot, and has been shared quite widely previously, and it's straight out of a primary school Catholic catechism teaching, religious teaching, and it depicts on steps of a stairs going from the lowest plants up to animals, up to baby not baptized, and at the pinnacle, baptized baby. And it instructs the child that God loves the most baptized babies and babies who are not baptized less. So they're closer to animals there in that regard than they are to Catholic humans. And there is no question, and I can tell you just from my own experience, and I think anybody who, I think we're not exactly the same age, but who is perhaps of your or my generation, who went to a Catholic primary school, will be able to tell similar stories. And I have stories of where, in dealing with, like 10-year-olds, where primary teachers went on extended humiliating lectures against pupils who were sitting in the class or against their families who were perceived to be insufficiently Catholic. And I think that the idea that that is A, permissible on the taxpayer dime, but B, in many cases, the only school that is practically available to people living in large areas of the country. That's outrageous.
Mm.
And I think that doesn't
Well,
happen anymore to much degree. I think, I can hear what you're going to say, that, oh, well, that's all in the past. And it is, to a large degree. But what I would be fearful of, and some Catholics and some people who might be regarded as more extreme Catholics have expressed a fear, which, and they don't phrase it in this term, but it's pretty obvious what they're afraid of. They're afraid that what they did to other people will now be done to them. And I actually believe in freedom, and I don't think that revenge is a good motivator in this. I think that even if the Catholic Church committed sins in the past, that's not any good excuse to victimize the current people, and I think it's a relatively small minority of this country, who are faithful Catholics, and I'm not talking about in the cultural sense, but people who are genuinely sincere Catholics who believe in the Catholic faith in a sincere way. And I don't see a way that you can have what is essentially a group ideology in a school in the average town in Ireland and not infringe on some people's rights. And if some parents don't want their kids to sit in the biology class, well, yeah, that's okay. But on the general run, I think that teachers should teach and not preach. And those two functions should be distinctly separate, and everyone should have available to them teaching. They should be taught facts, and they should be taught critical thinking, so they should be taught how to think, but they should not be taught what to think.
I would say, if
you want to do that, you cannot do that in modern Ireland and also have the country that we have.
I would say that if you want to look at the predominant group ideology in Ireland today, it has nothing to do with Catholicism.
Yeah, I agree.
If you want to look at the group taxpayer-funded ideology in Ireland today, emanating in many cases from institutions of state, which are telling you what to drink, how much to drink, how not to smoke, what to do, how to do it, the plethora of regulation and finger-wagging admonition and restrictions in personal liberties that are tax-funded, 95% of it is coming from the secular state. It's not coming from religious institutions.
Yeah, sure. I think, Mark, I think your libertarianism, I think your libertarianism is coming through.
I have to say to you, I went to the Star of the Sea school. I lived in Germany in the first 6 years of my life, where I went to, I think, a Lutheran kindergarten, believe it or not a Catholic one, because I grew up in a Protestant part of Germany, not a Catholic one. And in Germany, incidentally, you live in Germany, there's something called Kirchensteuer, where both the Lutheran and Catholic churches actually receive money from the state. And that is partly driven by the view that because of the extreme secular politics of the Weimar Republic created the vacuum that led to Hitler, there was a strong consensus with the CDU and the SPD that religious values were not only good, but essential to the maintenance of post-war German democracy. And I believe that the rising secularism of Germany, particularly the high secularism of the eastern part of Germany because of the social destructiveness of the vicious communist regime, is one of the reasons for the rise of the far right in that. But that's a different debate. But to get back, I did not encounter any of I'm not invalidating your experience, but where you said that certain catechisms or pictures denoting different values or classes of human being, I never encountered that, William, honestly. But if you have, I think it would be absolutely fair of you to document that evidence and to put it up to the Catholic Church and say, look, are these practices still are there schools where this is still being disseminated? Because if there is, I would agree with you, that's unacceptable and should be stopped. But I think if you want it stopped, you need to do a bit of sort of fact finding and compounding your research and present it to the public. And I think that people like me would agree with you that certainly that kind of extremism shouldn't be funded. I would say to you, though,
and who defines extremism? Mark, who defines extremism? What is extremism?
Well, that's a question for you and me. But I would say, I was looking at the results of the 8th referendum repeal, and I would have been in the middle of that debate. I would have seen the case for both sides, and I have to stay on the fence a bit on it. But I noticed one thing. I noticed that when you stripped out the home to vote, which is about 200,000 to 300,000, the number of domestic voters who voted in general elections who voted no is significantly higher than the 32% recorded. When you strip out the home to vote, there's much more, about 40% of the electorate who voted no. And the reason I mention them is because many of them will object. They will accept as Democrats that it was a democratic decision that went the way they didn't want it. Many of them might say, look, we now have a state which regards what they believe, rightly or wrongly, as an unborn child, as a second-class citizen. Not only do we have a secular state which relegates an unborn child to second-class citizenship, but it forces that significant minority of taxpayers to fund abortion, which they find morally objectionable. Now, I'm not saying I agree with their view, William. I'm not making that statement, but they hold that view as passionately, if not more passionately, than you hold a view about taxpayer funding as you see it going into religious instructions. So sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If atheists and secularists do not want taxpayer funding to go to funding religious values, then you have to accept religious voters will stand up and say, well, okay, I do not want taxes to fund secular activities that I object to.
Okay, that's a reasonable argument. It's possibly not the one for today. I do want to be factually correct. In fact, the Kirchensteuer, the German religious tax, is paid by the taxpayer, and you can declare what religion you are or none and not pay it when you pay tax. And to be clear, the Kirchensteuer was actually introduced in the Weimar Constitution. It came from the Weimar Republic, not from post-war, and it was introduced to Austria by Hitler when Hitler took over Austria in the Anschluss. But
I stand corrected, and thank you for correcting me on that. But I would still maintain, if I may, that it is recognized in the it is now recognized widely by left and right. At least it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s when I was living in Germany, even by the left of the Social Democratic Party, that 40 years before in the Weimar Republic would have tried to dismantle all religious influence. It was recognized post-war how important it was to have religious instruction. And it's notable that both the Lutheran and Catholic churches have been extremely important bulwarks against the rise of anti-Semitism. And again, the contrast with secular France is, I believe, instructive, as is the contrast between the western part of Germany, where that consensus existed, and the eastern part of Germany, which was brutally secularized and which is now a stronghold of the far right.
Okay, I don't want to go into too much details of the continent. I want to focus on Ireland for the moment. And one thing for the view, which I think is a wrecking amendment, I'll explain that in a moment, but the view which I don't know if you subscribe to entirely, but it is promoted by a lot of pro-Catholic people, particularly speakers from the Iona Institute, is that all the Catholic schools are there. Some of them perhaps will be taken away from the Catholic Church and given to the stewardship of other organizations or of secular organizations, but that you have a whole patchwork of schools, largely of different religions or of different ethoses. Now, I happen to think that's just physically impossible. Given Ireland's population structure, it might be possible in some very densely populated areas of Dublin, but mostly it's physically impossible. But my question is, even if it were possible, is it a good idea? Because I think it is necessarily the case that those schools will come under the influence of the most extreme among the religion. And I think that now, or even in the 1970s, no significant portion of Irish Catholics really thought that people who were not baptized as Catholics were lower than humans and closer to being animals. I think most Irish people had a moral sense that went way beyond what they were taught by the Catholic Church, and I think that they would not have followed that line of thought. And I think that's true for all religions. But we have seen, for example, in the UK, and there was what was called the Trojan horse scandal in Birmingham in Britain, whereby under Tony Blair thought it was a great idea that there would be lots of different faith schools. And of course, this is a much more densely populated country, so it is kind of physically possible to have different schools for different kids on the same street within a reasonable travelling distance. And I'm not going to go into detail about the Trojan horse scandal, and there was various other things happening, but schools were inspected, and a number of schools, Muslim schools as it happened, had behaviour that was just as problematic as the worst of what can be described in Catholic primary schools up to the 1970s and 80s. And just let me read a little bit from an Ofsted report that was done on Park View School. Students are not taught citizenship well enough to be properly prepared for a multicultural and diverse society. The inspection found a madrasa curriculum, and posters were found in the classroom saying, "If you do not pray, you are worse than a kafir." This is a slur against non-Muslims. Students were expected to fast during the month of Ramadan. That would be 18 hours of daylight in June and July, because Ramadan can fall often in summer, which would compromise the students' ability to learn and even their health. Girls who were suspected of being too friendly with each other were disciplined. Seating arrangements in the classrooms where the boys would sit at the front and girls would sit at the back. The annual sports days for boys and girls were held on different days to prevent them from mixing. Girls said that they were discriminated against and sent home because they were wearing clothes for a tennis tournament that was deemed to be too revealing. Subjects like biology and sex education were bowdlerized to conform with Islamic religious teaching, and pupils studying biology were not properly taught sex education or evolution. One teacher handed out a worksheet which said that women must obey their husbands and are forbidden to refuse their husband's sex. And the head teacher described the US as the source of all evil in the world. Another senior teacher frequently praised Anwar al-Wakari, an al-Qaeda recruiter who'd been involved in various terrorist attacks, and referred to non-Muslims as kuffar. Again, this slur. That I don't for a moment believe that the majority of Muslims, either in Britain or in Ireland, would have any truck with that. But the reality is that what happened when schools were given to the patronage of a particular religion, by definition, the more extreme people within that religion, the most active people, are the people who are going to be most powerful in that. And and I actually don't care whether it's Muslims or Catholics or any other religion, but I think that that is inherently dangerous. That where you have an atomized society, it is inherently dangerous that the most extreme and loud-mouthed and sharp-elbowed elements within each atomized group gets into such a powerful state-funded position. Isn't that a risk?
I agree, but we also need to note that for every religious extreme, there's a secular extreme. So, for example, the secular French Republic was built on the mass murder of 400,000 Catholics in the Vendée. It was a systematic policy whereby the secular state decided that law-abiding or
what year was this?
People of Catholic faith this was 1794.
Okay, but let's say in the last couple of centuries. What's relevant now? What's possible now?
So the so-called East German in our own lifetime, the so-called schools in the so-called German Democratic Republic, children were denounced. Had their families denounced in classroom for not being sufficiently socialist.
And not just denounced, were denied education, were refused to go to university, and so forth.
Yeah. So there's equally vicious hate. In fact, under Stalin's Russia, it was even more brutal. So both secular ideologies are as capable of generating extremism as our religion. So the problem is not religion or non-religion, it's extremism which can infect either. I would agree and share your abhorrence with many of the examples that you cite. But I do think, as you yourself acknowledge, that I have Muslim relatives in my family. My uncle by marriage is a Kurdish Muslim man. And the vast majority of Muslims have nothing but abhorrence for that extremism. And by the way, we have to be careful, because I do think there's a tendency in the media and the commentariat to focus on either the extremists in religion or on the extreme failures of a minority of clergy, be it whatever faith. And I know no news is good news, and the media's kind of doesn't really report good news. But I think we have to bear in mind that for every one of those instances, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of examples where Muslim children and Christian children have received fantastic character formation and moral formation through moderate religious instruction, and have gone on to make huge contributions to the societies around them through business, through philanthropy, through donations. For example, I don't know whether he'll get the Tory leadership or not, but Rishi Sunak represents the massive contribution of the Pakistani and Indian people of very devout faith, and often very stronger in their faith than Western Christians are. Let me finish this point by making a more general observation. I do agree with you, there is a problem in rising religious extremism. And if I may say why I think that is happening, it is because I feel that the moderate leaders of religion have been too moderate and too willing to give in to every single demand of the secular media commentariat, as a
Roll
result
back
of
that, I
which
didn't understand. Roll back, repeat what you said there.
So the point is that I believe that religion is not there to give in to the demands of the current time. The whole point of religious faith is to provide an eternal anchor in eternal truths. But I think what has happened in some religious cases is that where the religion has become too soft and too willing to surrender its core values, and maintain a moderate but strong adherence to what it is there to do, the result is that it declines, and you see the rise of more extreme evangelical forms of belief in the case of Christianity, or more hardline Catholicism. And I believe this tendency is evident in politics also, in the secular world, where we see for example, the Labour Party in Britain failed to actually represent the working class, which is what its job to do. It seemed more interested in capitulating to every demand of the business lobby, and as a result of which we saw the rise of the far left Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. Well, I would contend that both religious and secular institutions need to be braver in standing up for the moderate version of what they believe in. And unfortunately, that leadership isn't there. And as a result, extremism is rising. So, for example, Trump in America, one of the reasons Trump isn't there is because before him, the Republican Party didn't stand up for its values. So it's on the left and the right, it's in secular and religious institutions. And if moderate leaders don't stand up and stay firm, extremism will rise, and it'll happen everywhere.
Yeah, sure, but that's just a truism. But what I wanted you to deal with was the issue that if we have an atomized education system whereby each kid is filtered off into their own the school for their own religion or belief system or whatever, the likelihood is that the most influential people in each of those atomized sections will be the most extreme people.
I see where you're going, but the reason I don't believe this will happen is because I think one thing you might be forgetting. Well, one thing you might be forgetting is that the Abrahamic religions, which include Judaism, Islam, and all denominations of Christianity, actually 80% of what they believe in is common. Believe it or not, they have far more in common with each other than they have differences. And as somebody who believes that Judeo-Christian ethic is still, and should, as far as it can, without restraining individual liberty, remain the basis of Western civilization. It may not be, but I think it should try and remain so. And it should be possible to devise an education system that has a common platform of values for people of different religions, but uses what we're doing now. We're using technology. You're in Berlin, I'm in Dublin, and yet we're doing a podcast together at the same time. It ought to be possible to use technology like that to say, well, okay, if you have a school in rural Ireland where 90% of the children are Catholic, but there are children from an atheist or agnostic or Islamic background, it ought to be possible to provide a room where they can go online and share religious instruction with other Muslim children in rural areas who may not have the critical mass to provide a physical religious instruction in the middle of the day, but where online technology can be used to solve that problem. They can then go back into the school, and if they do, and with their classmates for the other classes, in which case I believe they will then fall back on what remains a largely shared basis of values that are common to all of those religions. And even, I would say, respecting atheists and agnostics who don't share a belief in organized religion, I have actually found, William, many atheists and agnostics are far better Christians than many Christians. I've often found, ironically, that it's the people, the atheists, who have actually rejected the tenets. They've rejected the trappings of organized religion, but I often find that they're inherently far better people because whether they know it or not, they have silently absorbed the best of those values that have been transmitted down from them the centuries. And that's one of the ironies of life, that quite far from the baptized being better than the non-baptized, as it says in the Bible, it's the stone that got rejected that will become the cornerstone. So I am not coming at this as a Catholic who wants to discriminate against non-Catholics. I am saying that religious values over time and religious faith formation benefits everybody in the long run.
Marc Coleman, former broadcaster and journalist, these days a consultant and working on a book about the persistence of Western democracy. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much, William. It's a pleasure.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter, but most of all, tell your friends.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Marc Coleman at Marc P. Coleman, Marc with a C. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for the next show. And thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. As I said, we don't get anything like what some other Irish podcasters get that I could mention, but it pays for things like web hosting. We basically do the podcast for free, but if you could do the same as the current patrons and donate the price of a pint of beer or even the price of a Brazilian beef burger once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you'll find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone or by email. All that information is at www.here'show.ie. And don't forget, we want your questions for the summer special question and answer podcast. You can email them to podcast@here'show.ie in audio or text format, or even easier, send a WhatsApp voice message to 086 606 9401. And there's a link to that you can tap on the website and on the Twitter page to directly send a WhatsApp message. You don't even have to save the number. We'd love to hear from you. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. The assistant producer is Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.